The typical discussion around free markets tends to focus on how much should governments be involved in them, or should they be involved in them at all. In other words, how free should the free market be? The discussion is not usually about whether they should exist at all, or whether there are fundamental problems connected to free markets that are impossible to rein in and control, about what kinds of things we desire from an economy, and whether or not free markets can provide these things. Famous economist Milton Friedman had this to say: fundamentally, there are only two ways of coordinating the economic activities of millions. One is central direction involving the use of coercion, the technique of the army and of the modern totalitarian state. The other is voluntary cooperation of individuals, the technique of the marketplace. This makes it sound like a pretty simple choice: coercion and totalitarianism, or voluntary cooperation and individualism. But, here's the view of two other economists. Rather than efficiency machines, optimal incentive systems, cybernetic miracles, and human liberators, when we examine markets we find institutions that generate increasingly inefficient allocations of resources, unleash socially destructive incentives unnecessarily, bias and obstruct the flow of essential information for economic self-management, substitute trivial for meaningful freedoms, and lead to irremediable inequities in the distribution of goods and power. Robin Hahnel and Michael Albert. Before we tackle what all that means, let's look at what a free market even is. All we really require of an economy is that it gets us the things we want and need efficiently and fairly. Free markets attempt to perform this task through what Adam Smith referred to as an invisible hand. Let's imagine a disaster occurs, and we end up with a drinking water shortage in the state of California. Demand for drinking water is high, but supply is low. This means that those who have a supply of clean water have the ability to sell it at a very high price. But, the high price of water means that for people in other states, who have an abundant supply of water, it is suddenly very cost-effective for them to transport their water to California and make a profit, thus increasing the supply of water in California. What this means is, without any external control or planning, without any coordinated effort, a shortage of water in California is met by an increase in supply. All that's required is many people trying to maximize their individual profits, combined with the principle that increases prices when demand is high and supply is low, and lowers prices when demand is low and supply is high. For this to work, though, we must ignore what happens if the cost of getting drinking water to the people of California is too expensive or risky to still make a profit. We must ignore that this system doesn't incentivize us to try to figure out ways of preventing future water shortages in California. We must ignore that this means that only rich Californians will be able to afford the now expensive water. And we must ignore that the cost of water will only come down if someone doesn't have monopolistic control over the supply. We must also ignore the words of Charlie Munger, vice chairman of Berkshire Hathaway. You have studied supply and demand curves. You have learned that when you raise the price, ordinarily the volume you can sell goes down, and when you reduce the price, the volume you can sell goes up. Is that right? Now tell me several instances when, if you want the physical volume to go up, the correct answer is to increase the price. Examples of goods which do not seem to follow the so-called laws of supply and demand are called Veblen goods, like designer clothes and luxury, specialized products. This happened in the case of my friend Bill Ballhaus. When he was head of Beckman Instruments, it produced some complicated product where if it failed it caused enormous damage to the purchaser. And he realized that the reason this thing was selling so poorly, even though it was better than anybody else's product, was because it was priced lower. It made people think it was a low-quality gizmo. So he raised the price by 20% or so, and the volume went way up. Commodities sold through an agent or intermediary don't always follow the supply and demand curve, as the larger profits gained through raising the price can be used to bribe the agent to push your product. An example being prescription drugs, where doctors are strongly influenced to sell brand-name drugs over generic ones. The problem: these are difficult things to ignore. Free markets are not conducive to long-term planning and risk management. What incentives are there in the free market to avoid or mitigate catastrophes like floods and droughts? In fact, the opposite is true. In a free market, catastrophic events are opportunities for profit, and profit is the incentive which motivates people in a free market. The incentive built into the system is not to avoid catastrophes, but to ignore or even encourage them. Free markets are a cutthroat system, with dollar voting. The theory behind markets is that they prioritize intensity of desire, because if the want is more intense, people will be willing to pay more, the demand will be higher, then the resources will flow into supplying more of that thing. Californians are thirsty, the market delivers them water. But it does so only to those who can afford it. If free markets really prioritized intensity of desires and wants, then there should be more doctors in rural Oklahoma than plastic surgeons in Hollywood. Instead, this is not what we see. Free markets are a system of $1, one vote. The more money you have, the more the market will listen to your desires, and so a rich person in Hollywood has easy access to plastic surgery, while a mother in Oklahoma must drive their sick child many miles to find the nearest doctor. Markets reward bargaining power. To quote Michael Albert, "If I have a monopoly on resources, equipment, venues, connections, information, or skills, or even on inclination to rule, I have more bargaining power, and I get more." Markets encourage things like planned obsolescence, where products are designed to fail, because then more can be sold, and dissatisfied consumers, because dissatisfied people consume more, and consumption is how people profit in a market. Markets encourage people to profit at the expense of others, buy cheap and sell dear. It's important to stress, all these things are fundamental in markets. They arise because of the nature of the interaction, the forces exerted on the buyers and sellers, and the information that buyers and sellers are provided with through the market mechanism. There may be ways to mitigate them in a market system, but it will always be an uphill struggle against something which is, at heart, about competition, not solidarity, and bargaining power, not equity. But, even if we set aside, for the moment, all the problems with markets producing antagonistic and unfair outcomes, are markets efficient? Because, even if we agree that markets lead to unfair outcomes and unhappy people, if they are an efficient and effective way of getting us the things we need and encouraging innovation and growth, then perhaps this is enough. There is a theorem in economics, which says under certain assumptions, free markets will lead to optimal efficient outcomes, meaning that the most individuals and preferences will be satisfied with the finite resources available. What are these assumptions? For brevity, let's focus on two of these. They are that the market be perfectly competitive, and that it have no externalities. The problem for us is that markets seem to violate both of these assumptions pretty badly. A lack of competition in a market means that a few players are able to use their enormous resources and bargaining power to set prices as they please, disrupting the normal rules of supply and demand. We see this happening more and more in our society, a few major players managing to gain greater and greater market share and near monopolistic control. The normal mechanisms for preventing this are known as market regulation and antitrust. Antitrust means forcefully breaking apart monopolies and unfair business practices. Regulation means government bodies whose job it is to monitor for behaviors that might get in the way of fair free market competition. The challenge is that antitrust and regulation will be under constant attack as long as they exist. Entities in the market aim to constantly compete, grow, and increase their market share, eventually becoming the biggest fish in the sea. Regulation and antitrust gets in the way of all this, preventing any fish from getting too big. They directly interfere with profit and growth. That's their job. Having the biggest fish in the sea is uncompetitive, and lack of competition makes free markets inefficient. This underlying conflict means that the big players in a market will fight hard to prevent these mechanisms by lobbying government and lawmakers, and spending big money on public relations campaigns to turn the public against antitrust and regulation. Cutting through red tape so business can flow smoothly. Small government, low taxes. Deregulation has become a buzzword. Antitrust is rarely carried out, and when done amounts to mostly a slap on the wrist. And all these attacks have been working, resulting in regulatory bodies which are underfunded and ineffective, and antitrust action which is non-existent, making our world less competitive and less efficient in the process. The second big assumption is a lack of externalities. In our description of markets being about buyers and sellers attempting to maximize individual outcomes, it all seems pretty simple. When I buy a car, there may be mechanisms in place for me to find a car I like, and allow me to compare prices and features, but the actual transaction and negotiation are just about my interests and those of the entity selling the car. I weigh my interests when buying. How much do I desire it? What percentage of my income am I willing to give up for it? What features do I desire? What brand should I buy? The car seller also weighs their interests. What is the desire for this type of car? What materials should I use? What features should the car include? How should I market my brand? But wait. The act of buying and selling a car does not just involve the buyer and seller. There are other external parties who are impacted by the transaction and the decisions the buyer and seller come to. In the not-too-distant past, making cars in Detroit produced sulfur dioxide, which went into the atmosphere and produced acid rain, which fell in the surrounding areas and turned the trees yellow, killed the fish in the lakes, and damaged people's property. A person who retired and bought a house in the Adirondack Mountains, and who subsequently had to deal with acid rain, was not included in the transaction between the car buyer and car seller, and the decisions they came to. Having more cars on the road produces more congestion on the roads. And it produces more greenhouse gases, which has the potential to affect literally billions of people stretching out into the future, and is currently affecting people in coastal areas who have to be relocated because their house is underwater. The person whose house is underwater is similarly not included in the decision-making about the manufacture and consumption of cars elsewhere in the world. The people above are referred to by economists as external parties, and their interests are called externalities. The free market, by its nature, attempts to strip away from the equation all externalities. This is actually seen as one of the benefits of a free market, as removing external parties makes the process of buyers and sellers meeting and exchanging things much simpler. Also, one of the easiest ways to make profit in a market is through externalizing costs onto others, for example, dumping wastewater into the river rather than spending money to dispose of it properly. Unfortunately, it has devastating effects on everyone else. A study in the United States attempted to measure the real cost of things when you factor in the negative external effects. They found the price of coal when used for electricity generation was too low by 70%. Using natural gas was off by 19%. Transportation using gasoline off by 25%. In other words, people consume coal energy because it is cheap, but it is cheaper primarily because it is externalizing 70% of its cost onto society. We rely on prices being correct to get efficient outcomes in a market, and here we see the prices are off by a lot, which sends very bad signals to consumers and producers, and generates a tremendous amount of waste. It turns out the market is filled to the brim with externalities. Are there ways of dealing with externalities in a market? Is there a way to pressure buyers and sellers to include external parties' interests? The buyer and seller might weigh the negative effects to others and to the environment, if they are informed about them. In other words, we can rely on, and try to motivate, people being more empathetic and compassionate towards others. The problem is that this is a challenging thing to cultivate and maintain. And, who is going to spend the time and money to do it? In general, marketing pressures us to not think or concern ourselves with these broad societal matters, to follow our own desires, to place ourselves and our own families first. Markets make it very easy to engage in individual consumption, weighing the costs and benefits of buying a car that you and your family will use, but are very bad at helping us engage in collective consumption, weighing the costs and benefits of having a public library that my whole community can use. We could also come up with a tax, known as a Pigovian tax, which includes the cost to the external parties in the price. An example of this would be a carbon tax. The problem is that trying to come up with a different tax for every externality proves to be impossible. Also, taxes such as these are typically fought against tooth and nail. Remember that the theory tells us that having a lack of competition and an abundance of externalities means that the free market will not be optimally efficient. It doesn't tell us how inefficient it will be. But, we can see in practice that these factors do lead to very inefficient outcomes. The economist Eugene Fama won a Nobel Prize for demonstrating that, in a truly efficient market, prices of all commodities would reflect the totality of relevant information about them. Therefore, a truly efficient market would eliminate the possibility of market speculation. It would no longer be possible to beat the market. Obviously, this is not what we see in the real world. So, if markets are so inefficient, and produce so much unfairness and dissatisfaction, by their very nature, and if the mechanisms by which we might try to make markets more efficient and more equitable are impossible or challenging at best, why do we still stick with free markets at all? I think a big reason is because we've been convinced that effectively there are no alternatives. Next video, I'll look at one of those alternatives, central planning, and show that it is indeed also terrible. In the third video, I'll show you a third approach, which might get us what we want and more, without all the problems of free markets and central planning. So, stay tuned.